Are you now? Are you warning me? Me? I'm Harold. I'm the one person you don't warn, Michael, because you and I are a match. And we tread very softly with each other, because we both play each other's game too well. Oh, I know this game you're playing. I know it very well, and I play it very well. You play it very well too, but you know what? I'm the only one that's better at it than you are. I can beat you at it. So don't push me. I'm warning you. Ho-yo, ho, ho-yo, ho, ho-yo, ho, ho. Hello and welcome once again to the Spouter-Inn. I'm Chris.
And I'm Suzanne.
And today we're doing a very special episode. We're going to be doing what in our minds is the last episode of 2020, although it's coming out a bit late.
The long 2020.
The very long 2020. We're going to be looking at a text by an author who we lost in the year 2020. And this time around, we have chosen Mart Crowley's The Boys in the Band.
This is a neat choice, I think, because it lets us look back on the play itself, but also on the staging of that play, both in theater and also in film, and how that changed over time. So I feel like it's a really particularly neat way to look back on our own past right now.
Yeah, I have to admit, when we chose this play, I didn't realize that they had just made a new version of the movie. So it's going to be very interesting to look at. I do want to say there were lots of other people that we lost in 2020. There was an article on LitHub that was filled with all sorts of names that were really interesting, and we could have done any number of them. Kamau Brathwaite, Michael McClure, Diane DePrima. But this one just struck me as something that I wanted to revisit. This is
me too.
A play that I had never read as a play. I had seen the 1970 movie of it many, many years ago, and I'd been meaning to revisit it for a long time. And, well, no time like the present.
Yeah, because the play came out in 1968, the film in 70, and I'm curious about when you first saw it. I know you rewatched it for our conversation today. I saw it, I think, maybe 84, 85, when you would rent videotapes. And at a time in life when that was a really interesting moment to watch that film. I mean, it was also historically an interesting moment to be watching that film, right? Mid-80s. And I haven't seen it since then, so that's kind of neat.
Yeah, that's a very interesting time to watch the film and to rent that video. I guess I also rented the video. It would have been in the early 90s when I watched it, when I was fairly, young and coming out and all that sort of stuff. And I was trying to read up on our history, as you might say. And I'm super curious about what it means to read this book now. And I'm super curious about the fact that he wasn't included on that article of notable literary deaths.
Yeah, I was really struck by that.
Yeah, it's interesting to think about this play and see whether it is being made canonical or not, whether it's joining a wider canon than just a historically important gay play and gay movie, but if it's becoming important in a broader sense, or if the canon is opening to include more of that.
Well, it's kind of a point of reference, right? I mean, even people who haven't, read the play or maybe even seen the movie know the phrase, the boys in the band, right? And they have a sense of what kind of work that play was doing at a certain moment.
I suppose so, yeah. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it's destined to become part of the canon. I don't know. Mm-hmm. So those are some of the questions that I want to turn to this book with, in addition to just seeing if it holds up, which it did for me.
Yeah, I really enjoyed, actually, for preparing, I read the play as opposed to going back and watching the movie. And that was a really neat experience. Do you want to say a little bit about the writer?
Sure. There's not a tremendous amount to say, I suppose. Mart Crowley was born in 1935. He worked in Hollywood when he was young, and he became an assistant to Natalie Wood, where he met the choreographer, whose name I should have written down, but it's the person who the character of Harold is based on. Most of the characters in Boys in the Band are based on either Mart himself, the main character, Michael, or his friends. Fictionalized, of course, and quite different in many ways. But anyway, he met this friend, and they, worked with Natalie Wood and gave him a lot of time where he was able to write The Boys in the Band, which opened in 1968, which is the year before the Stonewall riots that led to what we now consider the start of the modern gay liberation movement. It did very well. I mean, they played for 1,000 shows, and they made a movie version of it, which came out in 1970, directed by William Friedkin, with the same cast. After that came out, Crowley went back to Hollywood. He did some more work there. He wrote a few other plays, none of which are as well remembered, including a sequel to Boys in the Band, which premiered in 2012, called The Men from the Boys, which, for the most part, the reviews were not very kind to it. But in 2018, the play was revived for its 50th anniversary. This time they did, I don't necessarily want to call it stunt casting, but it was cast with all gay actors, all 9 roles. And that cast was tapped for the 2020 Netflix film that just came out a few months ago, directed by Joe Mantello and produced by Ryan Murphy. And then he passed away in March of 2020.
Yeah. I mean, typically when we're talking about one of the books we've done on the podcast, we'll talk about the book. And then if we talk about film adaptations, we kind of do that as part of the bonus or something like that. But here it's a very different kind of situation because it's known primarily, I think, through the films. And so we kind of have to intertwine that conversation.
Yeah, and I think it's worth noting that the 1968 play version, the 1970 film version, and the 2018 play version and 2020 movie script are all different. Mm-hmm. They're all slightly different. No major changes, but some tweaks that do change a bit how it plays out and how it feels. So that'll be interesting to look out for. But why don't you go over the plot, just in case anybody listening hasn't seen the movie or read the play?
So the play is in 2 acts and it takes place over a single evening. So in other words, it takes place in real time and in a single location. The play includes only men, which I say something about just because that creates such a different kind of feeling that I think is worth kind of thinking about. We start with Michael, whose apartment we're in, and his friend Donald arrives unexpectedly. We're told a day and a half early. There's conversation and some awkwardness because Michael's also hosting a birthday party for his friend Harold that evening. And Donald wasn't invited to this party, though he does end up staying for the evening. Michael gets a phone call from his old college friend, Alan, who apparently needs to see him urgently. People start arriving for the party. Larry and Hank, who are a couple. Emory, who's described in the play's script as small, frail, and very plain. Bernard is described as a Negro, nice-looking. And Cowboy, who's light blonde, muscle-bound, too pretty. And then finally, the person the birthday is for, Harold, who's said to be dark, lean, strong limbs, unusual Semitic face. Alan, the friend who had called Michael earlier, upset and needing to see him, arrives at the party too. And in some ways, you can see from those descriptions that I was just quoting, the characters start out as types, standing for a kind of person or an ethnic, racial, or gender identity. But in other ways, as we learn, as they engage in conversation, as things happen, they're deeply individual, with intertwined and complicated pasts. Emotions run high in part because of those pasts. Alan becomes violent toward Emory. Michael speaks hatefully to Emory and Bernard in particular and becomes aggressive toward Alan. Finally, Michael makes them play a party game, a game where you have to call someone and tell them that you love them. The game ends well in some ways, bringing Hank and Larry closer together, but painfully for others, including Bernard, who bitterly asks afterward, "Why did I call? Why did I do that?" Alan uses the phone call as a kind of exit strategy, calling his wife, and I think that's something we're going to talk about. That's a big turning point. The guests finally all leave, and Michael then exits his own apartment to catch midnight mass, leaving Donald alone in the room, but not alone in the apartment, because Larry and Hank are upstairs making love in the bedroom. So the description I've given is of the play, right? And the rhythm of that, I think, is so important. The 2-part structure, the climactic fight at the end of Act 1, and then that, I don't know what to call it. It's not melancholy exactly, but that very tranquil ending, in a way, after all the storms of emotion and even violence that have taken place.
Yeah, it's very much the quiet after the storm. And there is, in fact, a storm that happens, at least in the movie version. Yeah. There's a storm that happens midway through, which, it's a very literalizing of the emotional torment that's going on and is only going to get worse as the night continues.
That's neat. One of the things I notice in the play, they don't have a storm, but there's a really interesting treatment of light and darkness. There's a lot of darkness that happens in the latter parts of the play, where there's just a little bit of light. And part of that is just theatrical staging, right? But it also does interesting things for the mood and the tempo of what's happening.
What did you think about the play? Did you enjoy it? First off, did you laugh? Second off, did you cry?
I did like it. I found it difficult at first because even though I had seen the movie, I'd literally had not seen the movie since, I don't know, the mid-'80s, right? So I had to keep looking back at the opening pages that has a sort of a description of the guys, as a way of kind of orienting myself. But then very rapidly you get into how can I put it, the intricacies of their interactions, but also the backstory that is sort of gradually becoming evident. And some of it's done in a really overt way, this kind of exposition that Michael does of his own childhood past that happens in the opening pages, but also more subtle things that we kind of figure out about the characters and how they know each other and in what ways they've gotten to know one another. That's, I think, really absorbing. And also, I think what I enjoyed most about it or found most moving about it is the things that we don't quite know at the end. We still don't quite know at the end. I mentioned a little bit earlier, there's a birthday party going on, birthday party for Harold, and he gets a range of gifts. He gets a sweater from one person, and he gets jeweled knee pads from somebody else, right? And he gets Cowboy, who's actually there as a gift. He actually, at the end of Act 1, is sort of standing over with the other presents out of the way.
Yes.
She's charming. And there's also a photograph in a silver frame engraved with a date on it that Michael gives to Harold. And we don't know anything about that. We're like, wow. I mean, that's a very personal gift, right? But we don't understand the meaning that lies underneath that.
Yeah, it's something that very much moves Harold, but he's not willing to share with the rest of the group what's going on. It's something deeply personal between the two of them that seems to make him quite happy, but he can't tell, and we never find out.
Yeah. I'll read a couple lines of it, right? It's Harold has unwrapped his last gift. He is silent. Pause. Thank you, Michael. What? He turns to see the gift. Oh, a beat. You're welcome. Michael finishes off his drink, returns to the bar. Larry says, what is it, Harold? Another beat, right? It's slow. Harold says, it's a photograph of him in a silver frame, and there's an inscription engraved and the date. Bernard says, what's it say? And Harold says, just something personal. And then Michael says, oh, why don't we have some music? Right? So there's this space, this imminent space of some kind of something, right? And it's not long after that we get the terrible party game, right?
Before we get to the party game, I think I want to start by asking you, what are your takes on, let's say, the two main characters, or maybe three, but let's start with Michael and Harold. How would you describe them as people?
Harold, I feel like I have much less of a sense of, he comes, do you think of Harold as one of the main characters? It's his birthday, right? In that sense, he's kind of a main character.
I do, but again, the movie might be over-influencing me.
So from reading the play, I get much more of a sense of Michael, who we're with from the very beginning to the end. It's his apartment, so there's a sense in which we're in his space, right? He organized the party, right? It's his friend Alan who's kind of brought in. He's sort of at the center of a web of a lot of relations. And we hear his backstory in the opening pages, as I mentioned, and we see him... I was going to say we see him being deeply emotional, by which I mean also vengeful and damaging and hurtful and acting out a lot of pain of different sorts. And I was kind of struck by the character. It's not a perfect play by any means, but I was really struck by that. What makes a person like that? What makes you emotionally destructive even to people you care about? So I was kind of absorbed by that.
Yeah, it's interesting because they set up a few things, such as that Michael has stopped drinking and that he's doing better because of that. His friend Donald says, oh, yeah, you're doing much better now because of that. And he seems a bit proud of this. And it seems like a part of his life that he wants to leave behind. But as tensions start building in the play, as Alan shows up, his old college roommate who doesn't know that he's gay, as the room fills up with people who are engaging in high drama, he starts drinking and he gets meaner and meaner fairly quickly. And it's interesting to see this sort of loss of control, it seems, while also trying to maintain absolute control over everything that's going on.
Yeah, no, that backstory, with him and Alan is something that we hear a fair amount about, right? Early on and then also later on, but it's clearly got an awful, how can I put it? There's an awful lot of baggage tied up in that relationship. And if I had to sort of say one thing about it, I would say, they're friends in college. Michael talks about how he used to date girls. Alan would date girls, but they were really kind of close. There was this other guy who was a friend of theirs that, where Alan was kind of involved with in a way, but not in an acknowledged kind of way, right? And Michael, in fact, used to date the person who is now married to Alan, right? So Fran, right? So you must get the sense that, for Michael, they both led comparable kinds of lives, parallel kinds of lives, him and Alan. And at a certain point, Michael acknowledged and recognized and not accepted, but he was true to his own sexual identity, right? And in his mind, Alan wasn't. Alan didn't acknowledge that, refused to see it, refused to do it. I feel like some of the anger comes from that.
Yeah, no, it definitely in the back of Michael's mind, he's looking at Alan and saying, I know that you're a closet case. I know that you're gay because our mutual friend told me that you hooked up with him back in the day. And as soon as he tried to come out, as soon as he tried to make it, legit or readable or whatever, to give a name to it even, you freaked out and you dumped him and you ran away. Now, when confronted with this at the end of the party game, Alan's going to deny it and say that never happened. He came out to me and I dropped him because that's icky, as Alan says.
But we don't know.
And so forth. But yeah, it's absolutely unclear whether Alan is telling the truth there or not. It's unclear whether that is why Alan has come to talk to Michael in the first place, why he called him up desperately anxious and upset and breaking down on the phone and all that. Is it because he was trying to come out? I mean, certainly that's a very open possibility, but it could also be that he's just breaking up with his wife and having an affair or something like that.
Yeah, and especially because of Hank's backstory, right? So Alan, interestingly, we could tell is attracted to Hank, which I don't mean necessarily in a sexualized way. We don't know, but clearly he's comfortable with Hank immediately, even though he's never met him before. In part, you could see that, in the play, you can see that as being kind of based on how they seem to be. Hank is wearing a suit, right? Is dressed in a certain kind of way that for Alan is kind of like, might just be that kind of, I don't know, comfort level, right? Mm-hmm. But the others comment on he's hot for Hank, right? When they're making conversation early on, when Alan has just arrived, he asks Hank about his wedding ring. He says, "Oh, you're married." And so Hank says, oh, yeah, but I'm in the process of getting divorced. And then they talk about their kids and stuff like that. So for Alan, there's this weird kind of knowing and not knowing that's going on there. We might assume that Alan thinks that Hank is straight, right? But there's this weird kind of ambivalence when he says, "Oh, I'm sorry about hearing about the divorce." And he's like, he kind of backs up. Like there's just this kind of confusion that he has around his encounter with Hank. Hank later on in the play tells his own backstory. He says that, I was married and it's not that I didn't love my wife and, we had our kids and everything, but I was always kind of curious and I was just sort of, wrestling with this. And then one day I was coming down to New York for some sort of work thing. And I couldn't stop thinking about this on the train. And when I got down there, within 15 minutes of getting in the train station, I picked up a guy and, that was the beginning of it. And then now he's in this relationship with Larry, right? And of course, in a weird kind of way, that's kind of what Alan's doing right now, right? I mean, Alan is in New York, right? Looking up an old friend, anxious, this phone call, he was going to come over, he was not going to come over, then he just shows up, what is going on?
Exactly. Yeah, no, there's definitely strong parallels being drawn there to encourage you to think that Alan probably is gay, and this is probably also his story. The other thing I find really interesting about that dynamic is that until Alan arrives, Hank has been the misfit character. He is not exuberantly gay, so to speak. He's not participating in a particular form of gay culture the way that the rest of them do. He's dressed very stodgily. He's wearing shoes that, Michael refers to as unfashionable things he used to wear when he was still in the closet. He gives the sweater to Harold that Harold is like, and just makes fun of behind his back. He's not fitting in appropriately. And then Alan shows up and suddenly Hank is the only person who can talk to Alan. And they do this in this very straight businessman talking to each other. Oh, it was the wife. Oh yeah. Oh, you're into tennis. Oh, tennis is great. Oh, you've got to meet my kids. Oh, are you ever in DC? You should meet the wife. Oh, it's good. And this is happening in a way that Alan is finding his way into this group, or at least with Hank, but also that happens in a way that Michael can't even relate to his old friend on the same level that Hank can. And it just shows the sort of different layers of being part of this form of gay culture that are going on here.
Yeah. I keep thinking about this in terms of on the one hand, types, on the other hand, a kind of a spectrum of behaviors, what is possible, what is intelligible, who's intelligible to whom. It's a really complex ecosystem that I kind of have a sense of, partly because I'm old enough to remember when everybody was in the closet, right? Or not everybody, but most, one of my uncles was gay, right? And I knew this when he lived in California, he would rarely come out to visit. And my mom was really close with him. They'd been close growing up. I believe they had dated, in fact, in high school, before she went out with my dad, right? And, you couldn't talk about it in front of certain people in the family. My mom would talk about it. My grandmother, that is my uncle's mother, but it was all Like the idea like that's when I learned about the closet. I must have been 11 or so.
Hmm.
And it was anyway, so I remember that enough. Like, so that's like late 70s, right? I remember, so I remember when that, not, I want to say I don't want to say it was normal because it was not normal, but like that was the baseline.
Right. Yeah. That was just lived experience. Yeah. And then on the other hand, you've got a character like Emory, who is incredibly flamboyant, who has a very hard time fitting in with Michael's expectations of how he should behave when his straight friend gets here. Is there a term in that description that you read that for Emory? I forget.
Well, yeah, the description of him is that he's small, frail, very plain. And it's kind of interesting, like you were saying that like Emory can't hold himself back. And like, I find that character actually really, really interesting, right? Because he's the most flamboyant, right? He says things maybe you ought not to say. He'll often use feminine pronouns to talk about others, like he did, like in a time when Michael does not want him to and stuff, right? So he doesn't hide anything. Right. And in some ways, it makes him sort of a weak and vulnerable character, but in some ways it makes him in some ways the most assertive and strong in a weird kind of way. Mm-hmm. He's also the oldest one of the group, which I find so fascinating. I don't know if you noticed, but like when you look at the script, the way it lays out the ages, they're all almost of a very, very close age range, within like a few years of one another, except for Cowboy, who's like a baby. He's like 22. But everybody else is between 28 and 33. Mm. And Emory's the eldest.
That's interesting. I think
Isn't that?
He basically looks the oldest in the 1970 movie as well. And you might be curious to know that the 50th anniversary version of the play does not include those descriptions at all, nor is it in 2X, but that's a different story. And also, I should also say that when I say that Emory can't control himself, I'm not trying to insult him or anything. This is sort of how he's being presented in the play. And I agree with you that, yeah, there's something sort of more honest or true about how Emory is living. But because he is so undeniable.
Yeah, he's not going to hide. He's not going to hide anything.
Yeah. And that's what causes Ellen to freak out.
Mm-hmm. Because he insults Emory. He's incredibly aggressive to him verbally, and then ultimately physically violent toward him.
Yes.
Breaks his lip, right?
Although almost every other character at the party will also take digs at Emory for being like this.
For sure.
Even amongst friends, he's still making them a bit uncomfortable with how very he is, right? Mm-hmm. And that's also interesting. Like this whole thing, it feels at sometimes like it's trying to make it black and white characterizations between, this gay man and this quote unquote straight man, who may or may not be, and people who are sort of in the closet and out of the closet, and people who are doing this and that. But actually, like there's all sorts of interesting shades of where people are situated and how comfortable they are with what's going on.
Yeah, I'm really fascinated by the relationship between Bernard and Emory. So Bernard is black, right? And Emory is the effeminate one, right? And everybody has a kind of a type in their own way, but the two of them have an interesting relationship with one another and also inhabit a strange place with regard to the kind of overall masculine dynamic. I'm going to be curious about how this seemed to you in the movie. In the play, there's a kind of a nurturing and helpful relationship that each one has toward the other. Emory expresses it kind of in broad ways, like he's the one who's made the casserole for dinner. He's like sort of got this kind of nurturing quality that he'll sometimes display, and that's kind of lined up with the feminine behavior that he'll perform at certain moments. Bernard also, though, is like, he'll like look after Emory. Like when Emory gets injured, he's the one who takes him into the other room and like washes his face and gets him cleaned up and gets him another sweater and stuff like that. And there's this strange exchange that they have at one point, which I was really fascinated by. Emory will sometimes use sort of slightly racist language toward Bernard, like not aggressively so, but like in a mocking way.
In a familiar way.
In a familiar way. Like, I'm not saying it's good or bad, but like in a way that people who know each other really well and have an understanding do.
Especially in 1968.
Yeah, no, absolutely, right? And then there's a point when Michael starts being sort of obnoxious toward Bernard. Bernard kind of explains why it is he lets Emory do that. He says this interesting thing. He says, we both got the short end of the stick, but I got a hell of a lot more than he did, and he knows it. I let him Uncle Tom me just so he can tell himself he's not a complete loser. And so it's this strange kind of like exceptionality that Bernard puts in place for his relationship with Emory. And then Emory a little later on is going to, say to Bernard, Bernard, forgive me. I'm sorry. I won't ever say those things to you again. Now, maybe he will or he won't, right? But like they've got this kind of bond, which is a little bit different from the romantic bonds that some of the others have. Like, I don't know if they're involved with one another or not, but it seems like their relationship is partly predicated on how they're both peripheral to male power structures. Did you get that sense at all?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And in addition to the taking care of each other, later on, after Bernard is upset about having played the game, about having called up the one person that he truly loved, his childhood friend. It's actually more complicated than that, but it's not worth getting into. But he's shattered by having done this. Yeah. And Emory's going to be the one to swoop in and take care of Bernard and see him home, basically, at the end of the day.
It's going to be okay.
That moment is particularly interesting, that moment that you were just talking about. Bernard says that he lets Emory get away with it so that he can tell himself he's not a complete loser. And it's one of those moments where, like, did he just call Emory a complete loser? Like, is he saying the thing that nobody's supposed to say because you don't say that about your friends? But, like, is that actually how Bernard thinks of Emory? But even so, he's still caring for him. But it's just it's a few other people speaking after that when Emory says the line about, "I'm sorry, I won't ever say those things to you again." Right? It's a sense of, like, I didn't realize that was how you were thinking, but I didn't realize that was the dynamic that was incorporating. And the fact that, you know, he's using this familiar but racist language to him, that he's Uncle Tomming him, as he says, is part of him being a complete loser. And he doesn't, like, that's not quite what Emory's self-image was. And so he has to navigate around that.
Yeah, it's complicated. You know, do you think about Emory? Like, is Emory a brave person or a cowardly person, right? Like, they talk about this explicitly, right? When Michael is so aggressive with both Bernard and Emory, Michael tries to take the phone away from Emory and says, "I can do without all your goddamn spit all over my telephone, you Nelly coward," he says. And Emory says, "I may be Nelly, but I'm no coward."
Exactly.
And that's what he says, "Bernard, forgive me." You know, and so, like, he's the butt of jokes and, like, you know, he's got this kind of peripheral status in some ways, but he's also, like, really brave, right?
It's also interesting that in at least the 1970 movie, it is an astonishing performance that Cliff Gorman puts in as Emory. It is so singular.
Can you talk more about that? Because it's so long since I saw it.
He's weirdly, like, small and unattractive. And he's got this big sweater on, and he's acting incredibly flamboyantly. And he's got this tense energy to him, and it just bursts out all over the place at moments. It really creates this, like, thing that you've never seen done that way, especially when he gets to the game and he gets to tell the whole story about the dentist that he loved, who he just wanted to have as a friend at the very least, and how awful that goes and how it destroys everything. Like, he gets this incredibly moving speech about his childhood, and it adds depth to, you know, this otherwise potentially just sort of silly comedic character. You know, you really end the play thinking of him as a person, let's say, even if you are not inclined to at the beginning of the play, which I think a lot of original 1968 audience members, and indeed some of the people at the party, would have been, right? So he does just a fantastic job of it. In the 2020 version, it's played by Robin de Jesus, which means that he's Latino, for one thing, which changes the dynamic incredibly when it comes to how that playful racism is going. I mean, it still plays out the same way, but it tones it down a bit. And while he does a fine job at the role, I don't want to insult anyone in the 2020 cast. They all do fine, but it just doesn't have this sort of weird, unearthly energy that I think the original movie had. Harold, though, to get back to Harold, and is he a main character? This is an interesting question, because I think this is where reading a play doesn't necessarily give you the whole picture, so to speak. Because in the movie, in the 1970 movie in particular, Harold shows up, and it's a mic drop moment. It's like, boom. He brings this energy into the room. He is imperious. He is magisterial as he comes in. And to an extent that I had completely forgotten. And he's dressed very immaculately, but there is something kind of strange about his look. And he comes in, and he just has this crackling energy all around him. And he doesn't say much. Mostly he just sits back and watches everything with bemusement. And occasionally he will say things that sort of reinforce that. But it's clear that, like, all of this is spinning, and he is the eye of the hurricane. He is just the calm bit that's just looking on. He knows exactly what's going down, and he is perfectly Zen-like skimming over all of this.
Yeah. Well, you think about the structure of the play, like the two acts that I mentioned. I mean, you do get that sense of him kind of having this gravitational pull, right? Because we've all been waiting for the birthday guy to arrive, right? Like when Cowboy arrived, he came much too early. Cowboy was supposed to show up as the gift on the doorstep after Harold was already there, right? Mm-hmm. Harold actually shows up at the end, almost at the very end of Act One, and there's chaos, right? It's when that fight has just happened between Alan, when he's beaten up Emory. And so the first act ends with a Cowboy coming out and singing happy birthday to Harold, throws his arms around Harold and gives him a big kiss. Donald looks toward Michael. Harold breaks away from Cowboy, reads the card, begins to laugh. And it describes everybody sort of reacting. And the last line, Harold laughs and laughs and laughs. That's the end of Act One. And so that's a really interesting positionality, right?
But again, this is also this thing where in the original production and in the 1970 movie, Leonard Frey, who plays Harold, does this fantastic unearthly laugh. And it's sort of understood that if you're writing the play, I mean, I don't know what he was thinking when he was writing it, obviously, but there's a sense of like, if you've got that kind of laugh that's just bubbling up out of nowhere that you don't even expect from the way that this person is carrying themselves, that it reads differently on the page. It's much flatter if you just read he laughed. Mart Crowley isn't using any authorial tricks to get us to hear this particular laughter because scripts are produced with actors. They're refined over the course of, rehearsals and so forth. And it's just a sort of shell of what was made. And without that distinct laugh, which in the 2020 movie, it's just an imitation of Leonard Frey, right? It's the same laugh. It's somebody else trying to do the same laugh. And it's interesting to think about that sort of detail when we read plays like this.
Yeah. No. And what do you make of the character of Harold? Like you were talking about, like the gravitational pull. He's listening a lot of the time. He's got this laugh that has a kind of powerful effect on the people around him. There's also these passages late in the play that imply that he's, or at least Michael talks about it as if the expectation is that Harold's going to commit suicide at some point. Like, what is that kind of unspoken part of the story? I don't know quite what to make of it.
I don't fully know either, but I loved Harold in the 1970 movie in particular, but Harold is just such a tremendous force and a tremendous character. Is he going to commit suicide? I mean, that's definitely on the table, right? Mm-hmm. You get the sense, he's described as having been hoarding barbiturates, like he's getting ready for his big day. He's not taking them or anything. He mostly just stays inside. It takes him hours to get ready to make any sort of public appearance. Like it's just fraught. He's a mess.
Well, there's this passage where, we get it from Michael and not from anything that Harold actually does, right? Like the stage direction is as an announcement to group, right? Harold has been gathering, saving, and storing up barbiturates for the last year like a goddamn squirrel. Hundreds of Nembutols, hundreds of Secanols, all in preparation for and anticipation of the long winter of his death. Silence in the room, right? But I tell you right now, Hallie, when the time comes, you'll never have the guts. And Harold replies, what you say may be true. Time will tell. But you've left out one detail. The cosmetics and astringents are paid for, the bathroom is paid for, the tweezers are paid for, and the pills are paid for. And that's when the birthday cake comes in. So it's a strange moment, right? That's punctuated, like in the same way that moment of intimacy with the silver picture frame, that moment of intimacy was punctuated by dancing. This moment is of, I don't know what it is, this strange, heavy moment is punctuated by the entry of the birthday cake.
Well, it's this moment where you've got these two people who are trying to assert dominance, right? Or rather, you've got one person who's trying to assert dominance and the other person who isn't going to let him.
Yeah, that's right.
Michael is, going to try to tear Harold down for whatever reason that's not 100% clear, except that he has been drinking and he is feeling in a savage mood right now. And Harold is going to let him spin around, use up all his energy, and he's going to know that, but I've got this thing about you. I can throw this right back at you with a lot fewer hysterics, and I can be twice as cutting because I've accepted the truth of everything you've said about me. But you are scared to death about the fact that, even though Michael knows that, like, he is desperately in debt and nothing in the fabulous apartment that he lives in is paid for or anything, he's still like, he doesn't want that to be known. He'd rather people don't know about that. He'd rather people don't, except maybe his closest people and like people who will treat it sort of gingerly. He doesn't want anyone else to know about that. And Harold can just see through that and tear into him. But that's not Harold's goal at the party. Mm-hmm. He's just able to use that when it's necessary, as opposed to Michael, who increasingly makes it his goal to tear down everyone around him.
That's right.
This is one of the things I think about with this movie and with this play is how it's structured as an increasing twisting of the knife. There's one knife twist and then another one. And there's a lot of jokes and humor throughout the entire thing. And it can be very funny at times, but it is so much increasing the tension and twisting the knife more and twisting the knife again. And really, you know, everybody's going to feel very raw at various points.
Well, there's violence, right? I mean, it's mostly all just verbal violence as opposed to physical violence, except when Alan attacks Emory, right? But even like the language of violence, there's this one passage near the end when Donald and Michael are talking together that I was really struck by. They've been having a conversation. There's a pause. And then Donald asks, he's talking about Alan. He says, "Why do you think he stayed, Michael? Why do you think he took all of that from you?" And Michael says, "There are no accidents. He was begging to get killed. He was dying for somebody to let him have it, and he got what he wanted." And Donald says, "He could have been telling the truth. Justin," that's the old friend, "could have lied." Michael says, "Who knows? What time is it?" And Donald says, "It seems like it's day after tomorrow." And I thought that was such an interesting moment, right? I mean, it underlines that fundamental ambiguity, like, what the hell is going on with Alan? Who knows, right?
Yeah.
We just don't know. Like that one of that and the picture frame are the two big unanswered questions in this play, right? But also this idea of what time is it? I mean, sometimes it just means like, you know, how late is it? Like, but it's also like, I don't know, I found myself thinking about in terms of like gay men's lives in that time of the play, right? You know, it's before Stonewall, you said earlier, right? It's just before Stonewall, right? So stuff is happening and it's like going to be happening and changing in really extraordinary ways in those next couple of years, let alone later on in the 80s and stuff like that, right? And then Donald says, "It seems like it's day after tomorrow." It's a very weird temporality, right? Like it seems like, not like it's yesterday, not like it's tomorrow, but it's as if it's the day after tomorrow. I just found that moment really weird.
Yeah. Yeah. And I don't have anything smart to say about that, but it does make me think again about the question of the canonization of this text. And the question of, you know, this is a little glib, but like there's often a thought that a canonical text should extend or resonate outside of the moment of its creation, right? It should have maybe not eternal verities, but or universalities, but it should somehow be more than just an interesting document if you want to think about what it was like for some people in New York in 1968.
Yeah.
And does this play do that? Does it work beyond that?
Well, I'm curious what you think about that. And my sense of it is that it does capture a moment, like both its own moment of like the late 60s, 1970, but also, like I said, when I remember seeing it in the mid 80s, like it was because it was important for gay people to be filmed. I mean, it was part, you know, like you were saying, our history, right? It was a part of that world, you know, like, I mean, I obviously not a gay man, right? But like the person I was spending all my time with was, right? And so so that was the context within which you watch that movie. It was like, not as a guidebook to life, but it was like, okay, this is part of the culture. This is just part of that, you're part of the world, right? But so that's very much like part of that past, right? But I found myself also reading this thinking about like, I don't want to be glib, like toxic masculinity. In other words, like the kind of like destructiveness that comes out of misguided and misplaced strength. So I found myself really absorbed by that aspect of the play. And it was not so much sexuality. I wasn't thinking about that. I was thinking about masculinity a lot in this.
The thing that I was thinking about was my understanding that there have been many different forms and maybe phases of reception of how people have thought about this play and the movie. From excitement, you know, this is finally representation. It's finally a movie about gay men's lives in which they don't all commit suicide or whatever. Like, and that's exciting. To a real backlash of people saying, well, this is just a bunch of sad sacks who hate themselves. And this is saying bad things about what gay people are like, or it's a very limited portrait of what gay people were like, which, you know, Mart Crowley has always said, well, you know, yeah, this is these people. Like, you know, it's an important gay text, I suppose, but like, don't try to read it to be everything to everyone. That's not what any text is.
No.
I feel like at this point, enough time has passed that, I don't know, or maybe I'm just older, but I watched it and read it with a very different mindset of thinking, well, I just like these characters and I like the way that the tension builds and I like the humor that they're doing. And I'm not interested in telling the narrative of what it was like to be a gay man in 1968, the way that some of the interpretations of the movie, including a lot of the discussion around the 2020 remake.
Mm-hmm.
Of this idea of like, well, of course, before Stonewall, all gay men hated themselves and hated each other. It's like, well, that's not 100% true. And, if you look deeper into, say, Samuel Delaney's writings about his experiences at the time, you might get more nuance. But it's true that a lot of people did. Like that doesn't mean that, that these feelings weren't valid or even common. But mostly it's just, okay, these are people that they're living their lives and they're having these difficulties. We didn't really talk much about Larry and Hank.
Yeah, I was just actually thinking about them. I was thinking about the constraints, like not just the constraints on Michael in terms of, being open about and comfortable with who he is, right? Incredibly difficult thing in pre-Stonewall society, right? But Larry and Hank, right? Like they're a couple, they're in love. Right. And they're prepared to negotiate that and manage that. And, even though it's not easy, right? Because Larry is somebody who's not comfortable with monogamy and Hank is somebody who's only comfortable with monogamy, right? So that's not easy for them, right? But they clearly love each other and they really want to make that work. And then that's the positive thing that comes out of that awful game that Michael makes them play. But there's clearly like not really a language for that, or it's not working properly, right? Originally, Hank and Larry are presented to Alan as roommates. And then Michael says aggressively to Alan at some point, he's like, you have to understand when two adult men are living together, they are not roommates.
Yeah.
They're like,
which is less true now than it was then.
Yeah, no, but I mean, no, but like, in other words that, obviously there's no such thing as gay marriage, right? But there's not even like, there's no ease in talking about them as being lovers or partners or in a committed relationship. Like there's no, it's not that the language doesn't exist, but it's not being used somehow.
Or even if the language did exist, because there are people who got married, just not legally at that time.
Absolutely.
But it wouldn't have been readable. It wouldn't have been hearable.
That's what
by
I mean.
Alan. Yeah.
Yeah. That's what I mean. It's not legible or hearable somehow. It's not that the language isn't there, but they're just, it's not quite like, how can I put it? The lines aren't all connected somehow.
The other thing about that character arc, though, is that I seem to remember when I saw it when I was young, I remember thinking that arc ended up being very heterocentrist in a sense. You get these two people, there's this tension about whether one of them should be sleeping around or not, but they're all going to make it in the end. This time when I watched it, it was much more like there's this ongoing negotiation happening that the stresses of the night have gotten them to articulate better, right? That Larry, who wants to be non-monogamous, has been like, all of the schemes and plans and agreements that you've come up with have been yours. You proposed that we should have a menage a trois, which I don't want to have. And you proposed that this is the other thing. And you've said this is now the agreement, but they're not my agreements. Like they have not been talking to each other and hearing each other very well.
Right.
And now because of the game and because of the very public to their group of friends argument that they've just had, now they are communicating with each other. And that does not mean it will get resolved easily.
No.
It felt like it meant that, or it felt like it was supposed to mean that when I watched it 30 years ago, or not 30 years ago, maybe 30 years ago. I'm old, but it feels different now. And now it feels like just people in a really difficult situation who care for each other and who are going to have to communicate, but that in no way is it saying the monogamous view is better. In no way is it saying these two people are going to be happy forever. It's an open field of possibilities amongst the characters.
I think that's absolutely right. But what it is, though, and uniquely among all the people who play the terrible game, is reciprocity. The others have, Bernard has called up the person that he loved from his early life and doesn't get through to him. He, leaves a different kind of message, with the family on the line. And Emory calls, and similarly, these are unrequited love, right? It's only with Larry and Hank that we have, mutual love, right? Where they're both prepared to say it. Larry even kind of says it, not in playing the phone game, but he says, I love you in my own way. And then Bernard, jumps on that and says, oh yeah, he won the 5 points.
Right.
And Michael's like, well, he wasn't on the phone. Like, fine. He goes off and, does it on the phone. And what's really interesting, or like one thing that's kind of interesting, is that the only maybe parallel to that, and, isn't it, is Alan calling his wife on the phone.
Right.
Right, which is a super weird moment, right? He's going to play the game. Michael has aggressively pushed him into a corner to make him play the game. He's even going to dial the number for him of that guy who was their mutual friend who was in love with Alan, and Alan was, Michael says, in love with him too. That Justin, right? This is who Michael expects that phone call is going to go to. But then Alan is on the phone, with this person, and then Michael takes the phone. He thinks it's Justin, but it turns out it's actually Alan's wife. And how do you read that moment? Like, I feel like it's a very ambiguous moment. On one level, it's like, maybe it's this moment of mutuality. Okay, fine. Like, he loves his wife, and his wife loves him. He's going to go home and be straight now. Fine. But it's also, but it's also an escape strategy. It's a way to escape.
Yep.
Right?
It's very hard not to read this as Alan is gay and came to come out and saw what gay life looked like, and it was done. And noped out of there. And that this will not be a permanent noping, perhaps. No. I mean, who knows? No, yeah. But this is not what he was hoping to encounter. He wanted a softer landing into the gay community. Now, again, that may not be what's going on, but that feels like the reading that we're supposed to take away, or it feels like a very plausible reading anyways.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. But I do think the ambiguity is important. I do think we're meant to hold on to that ambiguity, I think purposefully. There's this neat thing that happens. You tell me what you think about this. So this Alan's finishing up on the phone. Like, Michael puts Alan back on the phone. Alan's like, darling, I'll take the first plane I can get. Yes, I'm sorry too. I love you very much. He hangs up, stands, crosses to the door, stops, turns around, surveys the group, says, thank you, Michael, opens the door and exits. And then there's silence, just like dead silence. And everybody's like, what happened, right? Why is he thanking Michael? It's a weird thing, isn't it? Because on the one hand, you're like, oh, well, you're at somebody's house, you gotta go, thanks a lot. But I think there's a thing there somehow.
Yeah, I mean, it certainly reads to me as if he's thanking Michael for
doing that to him?
Yeah, for pushing him to call his wife. The game is to call the one person that you truly loved. Mm. And he has made this decision that this is what his answer to that question is, which whether he was, coming out of the closet, whether he was cheating on his wife otherwise, whether or not, he's made this decision that this is how I feel. And whether he's going to hold on to that decision or not, who knows?
Well, this is why Hank is freaks him out so much, right? Because Hank says, it's not that I didn't love my wife.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
That can be true too.
You can love your wife and kids, and yet. There's a famous bit at the very end of the play and at the end of the movie, of course, where everybody has left basically except Donald or is upstairs, presumably having sex. And Michael breaks down at the disaster of a party he's thrown and about how he has failed miserably and how he has been shown up by Harold and everything has gone awful. And so he freaks out and Donald tries to calm him down and gives him a pill to take. And Michael says, I'm not even going to try to act this. I'll just read it. If we could just learn not to hate ourselves so much, that's it, if we could just not hate ourselves just quite so very, very much, which is largely read as kind of the thesis statement of the play, which may not be fair. I mean, it is the sort of author insert character. It is one of the roaming questions of the play, but it is also interesting to think about how the story of Larry and Hank actually talking to each other seems to be the other way out. Yeah.
Well, this is how it looks to Michael. Right?
Oh, yeah.
You know what I mean? Like you said, it's the author insert character, so there's something more happening there as well. But he's he can't imagine, I'm not saying Larry and Hank's relationship was perfect, but he can't imagine that.
Right. Yeah, I guess what I'm trying to do is sort of point out this line and then say the play isn't as invested in this line as it seemed, or as it seems, or as it's popularly held to be believed, right? That the play as a whole has enough people in it, enough positions within it, that it isn't just Michael's neuroses, Michael's desperate inability to love himself. It is, which everybody in the play has to one level or another. Everybody in the world probably has to one level or another. But that there are other ways out of these emotional torture games that they're all playing with each other, or these sort of one-sided demands and needs that Hank is putting on Larry, and perhaps Larry is putting on Hank, and, that Harold and Michael are putting on each other, that, that a lot of the characters are involved with, that they're just not communicating and not listening as well. And some of this is because they hate themselves too much, but there's more to it than that. The play feels deeper than it did when I read it a while back.
Yeah. As I said, I find myself thinking a lot about masculinity and what that means and what that's meant over time. And I think the play kind of invites us to think about that at the end, when Michael and Donald are talking about Alan, they're like, it's like, did he ever tell you why he was crying on the phone? What it was he had to tell you? And Michael's like, well, no, it must have been that he'd left Fran, or maybe it was something else and he changed his mind.
Yeah.
And Donald says, maybe so. And Donald's like, I wonder why he left her. And Michael says, as my father said to me when he died in my arms, I don't understand any of it. I never did. Right. And that's almost the very end of the play. And like that return to the father, right? Like, as my father said when he died in my arms, like, whoa.
Yeah.
I mean, men's ways of being nurturing, or in relationships, or in deeply, explicitly, openly loving relationships. Like, how much of a vocabulary was there for that in 1968? I don't think very much. Right. I mean, remembering, I don't know, fathers and uncles and grandfathers in the 70s, when I was a kid, I don't think there was much language for that loving kind of relationship, I don't know.
Yeah. No, I agree. I just think this play is thriving more when it is not forced to be the gay play or one of the very few gay plays.
Yeah.
And so I think part of its canonization, if it gets canonized, is going to involve not reading it as the first gay play or the major gay play that you must encounter, but rather a very interesting play about a whole assorted set of issues.
Yeah. No, I agree with you. I mean, I think we don't want to I wouldn't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater, like early gay play unapologetically about gay men. I mean, I think, that's good. I mean, we have to respect that and see that as that's an important thing. But I feel like it is still very readable. Like I said, around this whole question of masculinity, I mentioned when we were first getting started, this play just has men in it, right? And,
yeah.
And I don't want to say it's claustrophobic exactly, but it feels like that. It's not claustrophobic. It's just, it's a very distinct world.
It's a very claustrophobic play, very intentionally, I think.
Yeah. Anyway, Beth, that I feel like is still resonant because we do still have those kind. I mean, gender plays out in very different ways. We talk about gender and think about gender in very different ways in 2021 compared to 1968, right? And there are a number of moments in the play that kind of expose that, especially the way that he and she language, the way pronouns get used in this play. There are a number of really interesting examples of how that illuminates a very different attitude toward gender compared to what we might have now. But I feel like that's one of the things that makes that play still really quite rich.
Well, on that note, we probably should talk about what we're going to be reading next.
Yeah, our looking forward episode. That is, we have had one looking back at 2020, and now we're going to look forward at 2021. May it be better.
May it be better. We decided that the book that we're going to be reading, well, we asked around. I was interested in having us read something from a trans author. And we asked several people for recommendations because this is not a field that I feel particularly knowledgeable about. And I don't think you do either.
No.
And so we asked several people, both trans people and non-trans people, what they would recommend. And we have settled upon Eli Clare's Exile and Pride. It's a work that came out originally in 1999. It is both engaged with trans issues as well as disability politics. It is a collection of essays, but it's also written by somebody who is also a poet and who writes other types of work. And so it weaves together all sorts of different forms of writing. In some ways, it reminds me of the book that we chose last year in that sense, which was Lee Merrill's Memory Serves. It's a kind of a hybrid text. And I think that feels very appropriate for a work which we're going to be looking at to think with and to encourage us to look in other directions. So I'm excited about checking this out. The work seems very interesting.
Me too.
So until then, if you'd like to get in touch with us, you can email us at spouter@megaphonic.fm, or we're on Twitter at The Spouter, and we'd love to hear from you. Show notes with links for anything we've mentioned in this episode are at megaphonic.fm/spouter/40, and The Spouter-Inn is one of the fancy little podcasts over at Megaphonic FM. So until next time.
Until next time, see you again at the Spouter-Inn.